Marvel is bringing Avengers Endgame back to theaters 7 years later, but this is not a normal re-release. The new version is called Avengers Endgame Encore. It opens on September 25th, and Marvel says it will include material that connects directly to Avengers Doomsday. That makes this much more than a nostalgia play, because if the new footage really bridges the two movies, Doomsday may technically begin inside a story we thought ended back in 2019. The first confirmed detail is the runtime. Endgame Encore is listed at 185 minutes, while the original theatrical cut runs about 181. That gives us roughly 4 additional minutes. 4 minutes may not sound like much, but Marvel has built entire years of speculation from scenes that lasted less than 30 seconds. The bigger question is whether those 4 minutes represent all the new material or simply the difference after Marvel trims some scenes and replaces them with longer sequences. The commercial logic is obvious, but the story logic is much more interesting. Joe Russo has described the re-release as an important complement to Doomsday and said the new material is designed to enrich the next Avengers movie by connecting it back to Endgame. That wording makes me think Marvel is doing more than attaching a random trailer after the credits. The goal seems to be turning the ending of the Infinity Saga to the beginning of the final chapter of the Multiverse Saga. And if that is true, the biggest question is why Marvel chose Endgame specifically. So instead of telling casual fans to catch up on 7 years of Marvel content, the studio can say something much simpler. Watch Endgame again, see the new material, and move directly into Doomsday. That makes sense as marketing, but it also makes sense because Endgame left several doors open that the Multiverse Saga can now use. The biggest one is Steve Rogers at the end of Endgame. Steve returns the Infinity Stones to the moments from which they were taken, but instead of coming back immediately, he chooses to stay in the past with Peggy Carter and live the life he never had. Later, an elderly Steve appears and gives the shield to Sam Wilson. In 2019, that played as a clean emotional ending. After Loki and the Multiverse Saga, it creates a mountain of questions. What timeline did Steve actually live in? Did staying with Peggy create a branch reality? How did old Steve return to the main timeline? What happened when he returned the Soul Stone? Did he meet Red Skull? And most importantly, did all those trips through time really happen without consequences? Tony Stark already gave us the warning, mess with time, and it tends to mess back. That line feels completely different now. The Avengers defeated Thanos by going into the past, removing Infinity Stones, moving objects and people between timelines, bringing the 2014 version of Thanos into their present, and accidentally allowing Loki to escape with the Tesseract. They saved the universe, but they also interfered with time on a scale nobody had attempted before. And Doomsday appears to be interested in consequences. Dr. Doom's dialogue in the new marketing repeatedly focuses on people living stolen lives and being forced to give them back. I do not think Steve alone caused Doom, but the idea of heroes benefiting from altered timelines fits Endgame almost perfectly. Steve literally chooses a life that history originally denied him. That could make his happy ending one of Doomsday's most important pressure points. Then there's Loki and the TVA. During the 2012 section of Endgame, Loki escapes with the Tesseract. If you only watch the movie, that thread simply disappears. If you watch Loki, you know what happens next. He lands in the desert, gets arrested by the TVA, discovers the truth behind the sacred timeline, and eventually becomes the figure holding the multiverse together. If Marvel wants Endgame Encore to function as a bridge for audiences who did not follow every Disney Plus series, adding a small continuation after Loki's escape would be incredibly useful. They would not even need to film much new material. Existing footage could remind audiences that the time heist directly led to Loki's TVA story. That becomes even more interesting because recent Doomsday material appears to connect Loki and Steve Rogers. One theory is that Loki eventually seeks out the version of Steve who remained in the past. If that is where Marvel is going, Endgame Encore offers a perfect structure show Loki escaping in 2012. Remind us where that story leads, then revisit Steve choosing to remain with Peggy at the end. 2 unfinished time travel threads could suddenly become one Doomsday setup. The obvious question is why Loki would specifically need Steve. Loki now exists in a position where he can perceive and sustain the branches of the multiverse. If he needed raw power, Thor or another cosmic figure would make more sense. So if he seeks Steve, the most logical explanation is that something Steve did while returning the stones or living in the past matters to the stability of the multiverse. That is exactly the kind of reveal Encore could tease without spoiling Doomsday itself. And then we have Doctor Doom. Endgame famously had no traditional post-credit scene. Instead, the credits ended with the sound of Tony Stark hammering together the first Iron Man armor. There is a fan theory I absolutely love. What if Encore repeats that same sound, making us think Marvel is once again honoring Tony? Only for the camera to reveal that someone is hammering a metal mask instead? Then the figure turns Doctor Doom. Symbolically, that would be almost perfect. The sound that represented the birth of the MCU through Tony Stark becomes the sound that introduces Robert Downey Jr. as the man threatening to tear the multiverse apart. The same actor, the same metal, completely different legacy. I would not expect Marvel to explain Doom's full motivation in Encore. That would be a mistake. Not everyone watching Doomsday will have seen this limited theatrical version, so the added material cannot contain information required to understand the movie. But it can plant a question, a voice, a mask, a glimpse of Doom observing the consequences of Endgame. That is enough. Personally, I do not want Marvel to rewrite Endgame's emotional ending just to advertise the next Avengers movie. Steve's final choice, Tony's sacrifice, and the closing dance with Peggy already work. The smarter move is to use the gaps that were always there, show as something connected to Steve's time in the past. Remind us that Loki's escape had massive consequences. Let Doom appear at the edge of those events. Make the audience realize that the Avengers won in 2019, but the way they won created problems they did not understand. If Marvel does that, Endgame Encore could become more than a re-release with bonus footage. It could make us look back at one of the MCU's happiest victories and realize the next disaster may have started at exactly the same moment. Avengers Endgame Encore opens on September 25th. I already know a lot of fans will go simply to hear a packed theater lose its mind when Steve lifts Mjolnir again. But the real question is what happens after the applause stops? Are you going back for Endgame itself? Or are you buying a ticket because you want to see exactly how Marvel connects 2019 to Avengers Doomsday?